So actually, I was planning to have a pre-test myself. I didn't know that Shubham had planned for a quiz, but indulge me. So let me just go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my screen, and yes. All right. So what I want to do is, if you can see here, is there a number here? Yeah. So I want you guys to go to this website www.menti.com, and it will ask for a code, and the code is right there in the screen, and I want you to go and choose the answers. So the question here is indication for prophylactic cranial RT, and when you answer, I will see your answers here. So, and then we will move on to our slides.
So, Naveen, many of them, would be using
Like
handheld.
mobile.
Yeah. So many times they might not be able to answer. So I'm sure those who are wow.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I'll just give a minute, and then I will just move on.
Yeah. I am also learning new technology, boss.
Yeah.
This is so nice.
Okay. So you can choose multiple options.
It should also have a timer, man. They should have a timer.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. So I will make a countdown now. So probably in the next 10 seconds, I'll just close it.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So as I see here, so most of you have answered that small cell cancer lung, and few of you have told about non-small cell lung cancer, and again, a larger proportion of you have also chosen AL. All right. So let me close this here, and I'll get back to my slides now. Okay. So thanks for doing this, people. Okay, so what do we mean by prophylactic? When I say prophylactic cranial RT, what do we mean by that? So it's self-explanatory. The term prophylactic means that you want to offer radiation, you're treating the patients when there is no demonstrable evidence of cranial disease. So this demonstrable evidence, you need to define it properly. So you have to either demonstrate through imaging that there is no metastasis, or in certain cases you might do a CSF study to ascertain the status of the CNS. So either a MRI brain has to be done or a CSF study has to be done. And when there is no demonstrable evidence in the CNS, and when you're offering radiation for whatever reason, so that is prophylactic cranial RT. So why do we have to target only the brain, and why are we not doing radiation to other sites? Is because of this fact. So central to all the theme of PCI is the concept of blood-brain barrier. This is a physiological thing. We know about this. So basically, in the brain, around the vessels which supply the brain, you have very tight junctions in the endothelium. Not only the tight junctions, you also have the astrocytes and the pericytes, the food processes, which kind of seal completely the junctions between the endothelial lining, so that there is no uh, free movement of any chemical across the endothelium. So this makes it an extremely tight junction. So there is very selective diffusion of metabolites or chemicals across this barrier. So the blood-brain barrier actually is not one single barrier. There are three components, at least four in young children, but three at least in adults. So one is the blood-brain barrier, where blood cannot get into the brain matter, the parenchyma. Second is the blood CSF barrier, which is actually regulated by the choroid plexus. So this is between the blood and the CSF. And the third is between the brain and the CSF barrier. So in all three are similar tight junctions, where there is extremely regulated diffusion of metabolites and other nutrients. So what this blood-brain barrier does is that it makes the brain a sanctuary site. So you would have all heard this term, the sanctuary site. So it basically means that the blood is completely isolated from the circulation, in a way to say. So because of the blood-brain barrier, the brain becomes a sanctuary, right? So the implication of this is that when patients receive chemotherapy for whatever indication, there is poor penetrance of chemotherapy into the brain. So that is one thing. The second thing is that there are certain malignancies where there is a higher incidence of metastasis in the brain. So this could be because the brain serves as a fertile soil for the metastasis. So not only the brain parenchyma, but you can also have it in the CSF. It's either the parenchyma or it's in the meningium. So what happens is that, so you have micro metastatic disease in the brain, either because that there is poor penetrance of chemotherapy and there is poor killing of these cells which exist in the brain, or as such there is increased incidence of these metastatic foci within the brain. Add to the fact that the systemic agents do not cross, so you have increased chances of cranial relapses in malignancy. So where do we see this common? As you had gone through the quiz, so the commonest indication where we generally do PCA is small cell lung cancer. The next very common malignancy where we use this is in patients with leukemia. There are a couple of other indications which are not so common, and few of them are controversial. One among them is non-small cell carcinoma lung. So for those who had actually answered NSCLC, it is actually not very clear. The second controversial indication for PCI is patients who have extrapulmonary small cell cancer. I'll come back to that, what I mean by extrapulmonary small cell cancer. And there are certain uncommon indications like testicular lymphomas, which some people do, some people don't, but we'll again discuss all those things. So why the interest in small cell cancers? Why do we think that these patients require PCA? Is this fact that patients who present with small cell cancer, at presentation, almost 10%, 1 in 10 of them will have brain metastasis at diagnosis. And further, 50 to 80% of patients can develop brain metastasis while they are on their treatment. So both de novo and while on treatment, patients have a high incidence of developing brain metastasis. So not all these brain metastasis patients will be symptomatic. In fact, there is a study which showed that when you do an MRI brain, most of these patients are asymptomatic. Again, 10 to 15% of these patients with brain metastasis will actually be asymptomatic for their metastasis. So what happens when these patients develop brain metastasis? Why should we even treat these patients? Why should we avoid brain metastasis? Is the fact that when patients do develop brain metastasis, their survival, of course, goes down. The second thing is their quality of life is severely impaired because of this neurological symptoms that they might have. And also the neurocognitive functions like memory and other higher functions can get affected by the presence of the space occupying lesion in the brain. So when we say small cell cancer, it is not just one diagnosis. Broadly, when you classify them into limited stage and extensive stage. This is not the AJCC classification. This is the Veteran Affairs Lung Study Group classification, modified recently according to the IASLC. So what you basically mean by limited stage is the non-metastatic ones where you can consider them for radiation, meaning they can be covered in one reasonable radiation portal. And extensive patients, they either have a very extensive disease in the terms of disseminated metastasis, or their primary disease itself being non-metastatic but quite extensive that it cannot be covered safely with a single radiation port. They become extensive stage. So that's the difference between limited stage and extensive stage. And PCA has got role in both of these groups. So firstly, let's look at limited stage small cell cancer. So when people realize that patients with small cell cancer lung are developing a lot of brain metastasis, so there was initial interest in offering PCA. So empirically, it was offered in many patients. So it was not until the late 90s when people actually addressed this question in a more scientific approach using a randomized study. So this study, which was published in 1995, was one of the largest prospective randomized study. So what they observed is, so they basically randomized patients with limited stage small cell cancer to either undergo prophylactic crenulati or just were kept on observation. So what they observed was that at 2 years, there was a significant decline in patients developing brain metastasis when they had received radiation. So almost 27% reduction at 2 years in patients who received PCA. So this also led to fewer deaths. So subsequently, there were a couple of other trials which were published, which led to this now landmark meta-analysis, which was published in 1999. So this included about 987 patients, and in this meta-analysis by Operin, what they found is that in patients who had received PCI, again there was almost 25% a reduction in the rate of brain metastasis at 3 years. And not only this, this had led to a significant benefit in overall survival, a 5% benefit, which was statistically significant. So this kind of made prophylactic cranial artery a standard of care in patients who had some response to chemotherapy in small cell lung cancer. So there are some caveats to this meta-analysis. They also concluded that patients who received higher dose had better control. So one of the quiz questions was, what was the commonest dose fractionation that was used? There were multiple dose fractions. There was single 8 gray single fraction was used. Many people use 24 gray in 8 fractions. Some people use 30 gray in 10 fractions. But what they did observe was that when a higher dose was given, the intracranial control was actually better. They also observed that patients who had earlier initiation did better than late. So what I mean by earlier initiation is that when these patients receive chemotherapy and radiation, you start them early on radiation. So as soon as they finish thoracic radiation, if you start them on PCI, they did much better than those who, for example, let's say they started their PCI 2 months after their chemotherapy. And this benefit of reduced brain metastasis incidence and overall survival benefit was seen across all age groups. So this even in patients who were above 60 years and 70 years, this benefit persisted. But the problem here is two. One is the way that they had defined the response. So this meta-analysis said that patients with a complete response were the ones who benefited with PCI. Most of the trials which were included in this meta-analysis were conducted in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So when CT scan was not so widely used for response assessment. So most of these patients were simply evaluated using a chest X-ray. So when you have a shadow on the X-ray pre-chemotherapy and you're given chemotherapy and then you do a chest X-ray later and you see that there is some response, they were labeled as complete response, and then these patients received PCA. So now we know that it's not true because chest X-ray obviously misses many pleural disease or even mediastinal disease, so we cannot simply go by that. So the corollary to this is that possibly, since they took CR on chest X-ray, possibly patients with any response on a CT scan would still be candidates for PCA. So that is what we practice. Patients with any response, patients with limited stage small cell cancer who received chemotherapy and radiation and showing any response are candidates for PCA. So the only group whom you want to exclude are the patients who have progressive disease on after the first line chemotherapy. So when they have progression, it is unlikely that these patients would actually benefit with PCI because they are at a higher chance of dying because of their extracranial disease. So there is no real benefit in using PCI in these patients. So the second subgroup where PCI was extensively studied is in extensive stage small cell cancer. So there were multiple small studies, multiple single institutional studies, but not until this landmark paper by Ben Slotman, EORTC group, was published did we for sure know that PCA has a role. So this study by Slotman et al., which was published again in 2007, randomized patients with extensive stage SCLC to receive PCI versus observation. So these are patients with extensive stage and who have received chemotherapy and any response to chemotherapy, not just complete response or partial response, or any response as long as they do not have progressive disease, were randomized between PCI and no PCI. So again, as you can see here, there was a significant benefit in terms of reduction in brain metastasis. And also, if you see, the overall survival benefit was statistically significant. So the risk of brain metastasis was reduced by a factor of 25%, and the 1 year survival was almost double that of the patients who did not receive TCA. So this is statistically significant. This again led to again a change, and this established more the PCI as a standard of care. The caveat again with this study is that although this was published in 2007, this was conducted in the early 2000s. There was no imaging which was done prior to prophylactic cranial-artery. So meaning patients did not have a baseline scan done to establish whether they had brain metastasis or not. So it is quite possible that few of them might have had brain metastasis at presentation, and they were not stratified, and possibly they were randomized to not receive radiation. So possibly that could explain the wide difference between the two arms. So that is one of the major criticism for this study. So this led to the a more recent study from the Japanese group, where they did MRI scan for all patients, not only at baseline, but also did MRI scans at follow-up. So the earlier Slotman, the URTC paper, the study, they did not do any MRI on serial follow-up. They just did a CT scan or when patients were symptomatic. But these Japanese people in their study, they did a baseline MRI and also did serial MRI on follow in their patients who were kept on observation. So it was a similar randomization of 220 patients to PCI versus no PCI. And interestingly, they did not, they did see a reduction in brain metastasis similar to the URTC paper. Patients who received PCI definitely had low incidence of brain metastasis. But surprisingly, there was no overall survival benefit. So this is quite in contradiction to the previous paper that which showed a significant overall survival benefit, but here there was no overall survival benefit, although the reduction in brain metastasis was of similar quantum. So as I mentioned earlier, so one of the reasons why there was an overall survival benefit in the previous paper and not in this could be the fact that these patients did not have a baseline imaging, and possibly MRI is more adept at picking up micrometastasis, and these patients would have been labeled as progressive disease. So as things stands now, NCCN earlier had quite categorically said that PCI is indicated in extensive stage small cell cancer. But after the publication of this trial 3 years back, they kind of softened their stand, and they made MRI surveillance also as an option, uh, uh, as an alternative to prophylactic cranial-artery in patients with extensive stage. So what about patients with non-small cell carcinoma lung? So quite contrary to patients with small cell NSCLC, patients do not have a very high incidence of brain metastasis at presentation when you take unselected group. So this study is a randomized phase 3 control trial, which was again published quite recently, which randomized patients to PCI versus observation in NSCLC patients. Similar to the earlier paper, they did observe a reduction in brain metastasis. However, there was no benefit in overall survival. So one of the reasons why this study could have, why it failed to show an overall survival benefit, is that it took unselected patients, meaning all comers were randomized between PCI and non-PCI on observation. Now we know that NSCLC is not a single group of patients. It is a heterogeneous group of patients. Patients with EGFR mutation and patients with ALK mutation are known to have a higher incidence of brain metastasis to the tune of 15 to 40% at presentation. And also patients who receive therapy for their EGFR mutant NSCLC are at risk of developing brain metastasis while on treatment, because the first generation and the second generation TKIs, for example, gefitinib and erlotinib, does not have a very high neuropenetrance. So these patients can develop brain metastasis later. Similarly, patients with ALK mutations, when they receive the first line ALK inhibitors, namely the crizotinib or ceritinib, which do not have very high neuropenetrance, can develop brain metastasis. So possibly if you just tease out these patients and offer prophylactic cranial-artery, these patients might benefit. So there are a couple of ongoing trials which is studying exactly this question, whether in patients with EGFR or ALK mutation, giving prophylactic cranial RT helps them. But I do not see it to succeed too much, because now the subsequent generations of both EGFR inhibitors and ALK inhibitors actually have much better neuropenetrance. For example, osimertinib has a excellent neuropenetrance, and it is shown to be efficacious in patients who have brain metastasis. Similarly, if you take alectinib or brigatinib, so that also has excellent neuropenetrance and can act on brain metastasis. So uh, really have to wait for these studies to really show us whether PSA helps in these patients. But as things stand now, PSA is possibly not of so much benefit as this recent meta-analysis showed. Coming to the third component is extrapulmonary small cell carcinoma. So what I mean by extrapulmonary small cell carcinoma is patients who developed SCLC outside the lung. So it's more commonly it is not that SCLC can happen only in the lung. Patients with in head and neck sites, patients can develop in GI, patients can develop in GU. So multiple other sites, these patients can have small cell as their histology. What is noted is that it's quite a very uncommon diagnosis. There are only 2.5 to 4% of all SCLCs, and generally these patients are managed in lines of small cell cancer lung. However, when you look at their brain metastasis incidence, it is quite low as compared to SCLC of the lung. So again, since the incidence is not so high, it is not really warranted to offer PCI in these patients. So to just summarize what I mentioned about PCI, the role of PCI in lung cancer. So patients with limited stage SCLC, studies have shown definite benefit in terms of local control and also in overall survival benefit. So hence, PCI is indicated in these group of patients, and we know that early initiation is better than late. When you look at extensive stage SCLC, yes, there is a local control benefit, but overall survival benefit also is there. But it has been now challenged by the fact that if you do MRI surveillance, you might get a similar benefit. So you have an option of either offering PCI or doing an MRI surveillance in this group of patients. In NSCLC, there is a local control benefit, but there is no overall survival benefit. And given the neurotoxicity, it is not indicated as of now. In patients with extrapulmonary SCLC, there is very less data to suggest that it has any benefit, both in terms of local control and overall survival. So generally, it is not indicated, and a case-to-case decision needs to be taken on these patients. So coming now next to the next major indication, leukemia. Although this is not my specialty, I will try to give you a overview of where things stand with regard to leukemia. So leukemia, as we know, the management has changed over the last 4-5 decades in a significant way, and this is one of the most successful stories of oncology, where we have remission rates of almost 95-96% in both pediatric and adult ALL. So when all these newer era of chemotherapy started coming way back in 1960s and 70s, what people observed is that although the remission rates were excellent, many patients after a few months were presenting with CNS relapse. Almost 56% of patients in this landmark paper showed CNS relapse at a median time of about 9 months. So after they achieved remission, within a year, these patients were coming back. Almost 1 in 2 patients were coming back with CNS disease. So that made people think as to how to go about it. Most of these patients with leukemia, when you evaluate them at a baseline, they do not show a very high incidence of CNS involvement. So the risk is quite low. So only 3 to 7% of these patients would actually have CNS disease at presentation. But as I mentioned earlier, more than 50% of adult patients would go on to develop CNS relapse if they do not receive any CNS directed therapy. Similarly, in AML, although it is quite uncommon, the presentation of CNS involvement is quite low, and also the CNS relapse is not so common as you see with ALL. Not all patients with leukemia are at higher risk of developing CNS relapse. There are few factors which you need to definitely consider. So this is again for the residents to remember. So patients with T cell morphology of ALL are at a higher risk of having CNS relapse. Patients with high WBC counts at presentation, patients with a mature or a precursor B cell subtype are again at a high risk of CNS involvement. Patients who present with elevated LDH levels are also at high risk of developing CNS relapse. So what we know is that these patients require some form of prophylactic therapy. So that's the reason why any patient who presents with leukemia, the routine workup would include doing a lumbar puncture to make sure that these patients do not have CNS involvement at presentation. Generally, a flow cytometry is also done to increase the sensitivity of lumbar puncture. MRI is not done in all patients, but if patients have any neurological deficits, if they present with some neurological signs and their CSF is not very conclusive, then it is recommended that you do MRI. So with the modern chemotherapy regimens, which started also addressing the CNS, not just through intravenous chemotherapy, but CNS directed therapy, which means that patients would receive some form of intrathecal chemotherapy. Methotrexate is the most common intrathecally administered chemotherapy. When they started using IT and the triple IT methotrexate and other chemotherapy like cytarabine, what people realized is that the incidence of CNS relapse had significantly reduced. So before this, when people were also receiving CSI, and some patients received prophylactic cranial radiation along with intrathecal methotrexate, there, as you can see, the incidence of CNS relapse quite dramatically cut down. So the thing as things stand now is that patients with ALL, the commonest thing that these patients would undergo is a more intense chemotherapy regimen, which would possibly include receiving a high dose of systemic chemotherapy with methotrexate or cytarabine, high enough so that their CNS concentration is also of therapeutic range, so that any micrometastatic disease in the brain is taken care of. Protocols such as hyper-CVAD is even more intense than high-dose methotrexate and cytarabine. And all these intense chemotherapy regimens, what they have succeeded in doing is that they have kind of negated the need for prophylactic cranial radiation. Although most of the earlier trials, if you look at the BFM 90 protocol or the BFM 95 or the UKLL protocol, many of the earlier versions did include using prophylactic cranial RT in those patients. But since now we have better chemotherapy regimens and better anti-emetics and other supportive care to take care of all the side effects of high dose chemotherapy, slowly PCI has kind of been phased out in many of the Western countries. However, there are few centers in the North America and even within our country where we still continue doing prophylactic cranial RT, and where we do PCI in ALL is in the patients whom I mentioned earlier, patients who are at a high risk of having CNS relapse. The high risk patients would receive PCI as part of their CNS directed therapy. So this is a very recently published recommendation from the International Lymphoma Radiation Oncology Group, the ILROG, where they currently do not recommend PCI not only in children but also in adults with CNS 1 and 2 in 1. So basically CNS 1 and 2 means CSF with no blast or CSF with less than 5 WBCs. What they do say is that patients who have CNS 3, that means more than 5 WBCs, or if they have any blast cells seen in their CSF, so there you have to offer cranial RT, or when patients present with CNS relapse, there again you offer PCI. So this I am not discussing because when patients have CNS3 or a CNS relapse, it is technically not prophylactic because that becomes therapeutic cranial radiation. So for an exam point of view, you should not mention that when the question is prophylactic cranial RT. So our policy at our institution is that all patients with high risk ALL and some patients with CNS relapse would continue receiving PCI. The dose that patients receive when they receive PCI is that 12 gray in 8 fractions is 1.5 gray per fraction. So coming now to dose, so I think I've covered most of the indications, including leukemia and lung cancer. We'll again summarize that at the end. To mention about the doses, is there a radiobiology behind the doses that we use? Why do we use such a low dose, apart from the fact that we want to minimize side effects? Is the reason that the reason why we started doing 20 gray or 12 gray is largely empirical. Nobody really studied this extensively when they started using. But what we know is that when the patients have macroscopic tumors, there is a definite threshold. So if you give any dose below that threshold, radiation is not going to work. But this cannot be said same for subclinical disease. Many of these dose response relationship curves have shown that there is no threshold which exists below which radiation does not work in subclinical disease, and the slope is quite shallow and the response is quite linear. So this basically means that even at low doses there is going to be some response. So that's the reason why the doses of 20 gray also work, and we have kind of stick to lower doses because the toxicity with higher doses obviously are going to be more. So we want to minimize the toxicity. So we have kept the dose to lesser as possible. So as I mentioned earlier in the meta-analysis by Operant, they did show that when patients received a higher dose, there was a better control. But again, this was not tested in any randomized control trial. For example, in small cell cancer, we don't know whether 25 gray versus 36 gray until this trial was done. So this is a study by Lepechov, which was published a decade back. So they asked the question that is 25 gray in 10 fraction better than 36 gray, or in terms of local control and in terms of toxicity. So 36 gray in 18 fractions, a higher dose versus a low dose of 25 gray. So what they observed is that the incidence of brain metastasis is absolutely no different between low dose and high dose. The overall survival is, again, there was no difference between the two arms. So what they also observed is that both the doses of 25 gray and 36 gray can potentially lead to a certain neurocognitive deficits, including communication deficits and intellectual deficits and memory losses. So between low dose and high dose, again, there is no benefit in doing high dose and the possibility of a higher toxicity. So we better stick to low doses. So this is another a larger study of 265 patients the RTOG had conducted similar to this trial in Europe, where they showed that higher doses actually resulted in higher neurotoxicity. So we are better off sticking to lower doses. So as I mentioned there, in small cell, we do stick on to 25 gray in 10 fractions as our institution policy, and that is what most centers across the world do. And in leukemia, it is as low as possible because you use this in kids, you do keep it as low as possible. So 12 gray in 8 fraction or equivalent dose is what you need to do. So coming now next to the next section, radiation planning techniques. So what we need to be very sure here is the volumes that we treat. So it is quite different for small cell lung cancer and leukemia. The volume that you want to treat in a patient with lung cancer is the entire brain parenchyma. That is because these patients develop parenchymal metastasis. A very, very small percentage of patients will actually have only meningeal involvement. Most patients would have both parenchymal and meningeal involvement, but never meningeal disease alone. So the volume that you want to treat in a patient with small cell cancer is the entire brain parenchyma, as opposed to patients in leukemia, where, as I mentioned earlier, the entire CNS is at risk. So entire CNS means the CSF, the subarachnoid space, which contains the CSF, not only the intracranial, but also the entire spinal cord. So both of them are at risk of having disease. So does this mean that we should radiate both? And as I showed earlier, many of the earlier trials did use CSF. But now that we started using intrathecal methotrexate and high dose chemotherapy, which can potentially reach therapeutic doses in the CSF, it is no longer needed that we do CSI in these patients. But we still treat only the intracranial component of the subarachnoid space in patients with leukemia when we do PCA. So this is a major difference that I want to again emphasize on. In small cell lung cancer, the treatment volume should include the entire brain, and in patients with leukemia, it has to include the entire subarachnoid space. So when you do PCA, it's quite simple. Many of the times we just do clinical planning, and when you do have a simulator, and when you do CT planning, you know that it's not so difficult. You can easily do it. But when you are just doing a 2D simulation, there are a couple of things which you need to keep in mind. So I draw your attention to these three facts. One is you need to look at the temporal fossa. Second thing that you need to look at is the cribriform plate, and the third one is the optic nerve. So what I mean by these three facts is that you need to know the anatomy properly and make sure that you do not miss out these three important structures, because the earlier, if you see the experience from the PSYOP when they treated patients with medulloblastoma, these three sites, when they were missed inadvertently, resulted in higher relapses at these sites. So when you look at the skull base anatomy, so if you can see my pointer, so this is your cribriform plate, this is your your orbital roof, and this is your temporal fossa. Okay, so if you have some markers kept at these anatomical landmarks, and you take a lateral view radiograph, what you can see here is that although on this sagittal section, it seems like both the orbital roof and the cribriform plate are at the same level. It is not the case. The cribriform plate remains at a much lower level compared to the orbital roof. So this is a very important thing that you need to keep in mind, because when you're placing your shields, you need to shield the eye when you're treating your PCA. If you keep your eye shield quite close to your orbital roof, thinking that this is where my brain ends, you are significantly missing out parts of frontal lobe, and you can have patients developing relapses here. Similarly, this is where your temporal lobe is. So you might think, okay, this is my skull base, this is where your pituitary gland here is, and if you just keep your margin here, then you're going to completely miss out patients who uh, 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 can develop relapses in their temporal lobe. The third important thing that you also need to remember, although not shown in this slide, is the optical nerve has got some meningeal reflections as it enters into the orbit and while it penetrates into the eyeball. So the optic nerve, as you know, has an intracanalicular part, it's an intracranial part, it has got an intraorbital part, and also it has got an intraocular part. So as it penetrates into the globe, it would still have meningeal reflections. So that means there is some subarachnoid space there which needs to be addressed. That is precisely the reason why when we do PCI, we do not shield the eye completely here, but we need to kind of put our shield anterior to your lens or just behind the lens, making sure the posterior part of the globe is not shielded. So this is a very important thing that you need to remember. So the cribriform plate is one place which you need to take care of, the temporal fossa and the posterior globe. So these three components have to be kept in mind while you're planning PCA with either clinical planning or through CT based planning. So most of us, for example, we at Tata, when we do PCA, we generally do not even do any planning, meaning planning CT or an X-ray. We many of the times just do clinical planning. So a German helmet technique is what we generally use. So the anatomical landmarks, again for the resident's sake, is that you put your, so the entire head has to be treated, and where you put your shield is that, so this is your superior orbital ridge. So just below that you put your mark, and then again you make sure just in front of your inner your outer canthus you keep another line, and you draw a line to 1 centimeter in front of the tragus, and then again you go till C2, and that makes your, so this part is completely shielded, and this is the radiation volume that you need to treat. So this is what this is how it would look when you do clinical planning. So again, the posterior globe has to be covered adequately, the cribriform plate has to be taken care of, the temporal lobe has to be adequately addressed, And this shielding, again, when you're treating leukemia kids, you need to be careful because many of them will have unerupted teeth. So you have to make sure that you shield this area. Otherwise, what can happen is that they can have delayed eruption, leading to problems in dentition later. So you have to make sure that you shield this part adequately, the oral cavity and the unerupted teeth if there are any. Also, you have to make sure that this part is again shielded. So this is where your pharynx is. Your pharynx is. If you keep this border quite anteriorly, what can happen is that some part of your posterior pharyngeal wall can get radiated unnecessarily, leading to pharyngitis in many patients. This is typically kept at the dens. So this is the odontoid process. You just keep your posterior border at the just posterior to the dens, and this would cover uh, uh, your brainstem here. So most of your borders are quite explanatory. You keep them in the air. The inferior border is kind of again empirical. So many of us keep it at C1, C2. Some of us keep it C2, C3. There is absolutely no consensus on this. There is absolutely no scientific rationale as to where to keep it. Some protocols say C1, C2. Some protocols say C2, C3. So the institution where I worked earlier, we did keep it C2, C3, and now here in TMH we do C1, C2. So there is no real right or wrong, but anything is fine as long as you give adequate margin to your foramen magnum. So the posterior fossa sometimes lies here, so you have to make sure that you are giving adequate margin to your cerebellum here. Otherwise, if you just keep it at C1, C2, sometimes it might just cut off your cerebellum might be in the penumbra. So that is all you need to take into account. So the toxicities associated with PCI are both acute and chronic. As I mentioned earlier, when you give a higher doses, some patients do develop alopecia, but many of these patients would have been on chemotherapy, so it's really not so significant. Patients can develop fatigue when you radiate their entire brain, and as I said there, if you do not take care of your posterior pharyngeal wall shielding, you can end up with patients having pharyngitis. The chronic side effects are more common when you do 25 gray or a higher dose. So neurocognitive deficits and higher functions can be affected, especially memory. Patients, pediatric patients, when you do PCA, can have endocrine disorders, especially if their pituitary gland is getting a good amount of dose, and this can lead to growth retardation. Any dose of radiation is potentially carcinogenic. So secondary cancers are likely, especially brain tumors in patients who receive radiation, in kids especially. Delayed dentition, as I mentioned earlier, and cataract formation is common when the posterior globe, when there is some scatter from the radiation there. So how do we negate or mitigate the side effects of radiation? So some of the recent advances have tried to do this. So one thing that has kind of received a lot of traction in the last couple of years is hippocampal sparing. So we basically are extrapolating some of our experience from the RTOG 933, which is basically hippocampal sparing RT in patients with brain metastasis. So people have evaluated whether hippocampal PCI can also be of benefit. So there is one large phase 3 randomized control trial which has not been published yet, but it was presented recently in ISTRO 2019 last year, where 168 patients were actually randomized between a normal PCI versus a hippocampal sparing PCI, and there was no difference in any of those neurocognitive domains that were evaluated through the Hopkins verbal learning test. Both the group of patients had some decline in their points, and importantly, what was noted is that there was no metastasis in the avoidance region. So when you draw the hippocampus and then you give a margin and you avoid doses to that structure, but still all these perihippocampal region, there was no increased incidence of metastasis. So it is possibly it is safer to do this, but the benefit is not really there, and we possibly need to wait to see if there is a late uh, uh, benefit in these patients. So certain pharmaceuticals have also been used, especially Mementin and donepezil. Mementin is an NDMA antagonist. Uh, excuse me. So RTOG 614 was a randomized trial, which is again in the setting of brain metastasis patients, where patients were randomized to receive radiation with Memantine and without Memantine, and there was lesser decline in the delayed recall in patients who had received Memantine, although it was not statistically significant. But since it is a very safe drug to use, many people do recommend using Memantine when you are doing any type of brain radiation, especially if you expect the patient to survive quite long. So that kind of completes my my talk, and I would summarize this seminar this way. So as residents, if you are faced with this question, so if you have prophylactic cranial, I do not expect this to be a long answer ever, but this is likely to be a short answer question. So how I would, what I would expect when I see answer sheet is that I would want to know the definition mentioning that this is prophylactic cranial offered in patients who do not have any demonstrable cranial disease. The rationale behind offering PCI, because patients, because of the presence of the blood-brain barrier, patients have poor penetrance of chemotherapy into the brain, and also there are certain malignancies which have higher incidence of brain metastasis. The indications mainly are small cell cancer lung, both limited stage and extensive stage. If there is time, I would expect you to mention at least about the important trials, especially the operant meta-analysis in limited stage SCLC and the Slotman paper for extensive stage SCLC and the Takahashi's Japanese paper in extensive stage NSCLC. And you can also mention that non-small cell carcinoma lung, although there is benefit in terms of local control, there is no overall survival benefit, as shown by the Elizabeth Goes RTOG 214 paper. And coming to toxicity, I forgot to mention here. So you need to mention about the doses, the various dose fractions which are used for different doses for small cell cancer lung and for leukemia. And the reason why we are using lower doses is also you can give the radiobiological rationale that I mentioned earlier, and mention the fact that these patients are prone to develop both acute and late toxicity. And you can conclude by saying that hippocampal sparing PCI is of some recent interest, along with usage of Memantine and donepezil. So I'll stop there and I'll take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Naveen, for an excellent presentation and elaborative presentation, especially for the juniors who are preparing for the exam. And you have nicely explained the target volumes, which are always confusing, where to take, and like posterior globe of the eyeball, that is always a confusion. So there are few questions, like one of the participants has asked why we take the C2 border, why we take our volumes up to the C2 border.
So I just mentioned that. So between, when you look at all the protocols for PCA in small cell or PCA in leukemias, there is no clear radiobiological, there is no clear rationale for this. The only thing that I would mention is that C1, C2 is possibly enough, but I would choose C2, C3 when the cerebellum is not getting covered adequately. So let me again go back to my screen. I will show you what I mean through this. Yeah, can you see this?
And I will interrupt you, Dr. Naveen. I think few participants also want to know the 2D borders again.
All right, okay. So just to recapitulate,
yeah,
your superior border and your anterior border are in the air. You give at least 1 to 2 centimeter margins to the skull that you see here. So this is basically because you want to have a penumbra, and anteriorly again this is in the air, and posteriorly also it's in the air. Inferiorly, as I mentioned, it is either C1, C2 or C2, C3 junction. What is important is that you need to take into account a penumbra margin to the posterior fossa. The cerebellum is here, so depending on whether the head is extended or flexed, you need to make sure that you're giving adequate margin here. So if the head is nicely flexed, so possibly in this patient, a C1, C2 junction alone would have sufficed. But since the head is kind of extended here, so that's why C2, C3 is necessary to give a margin here. So when I'm doing a 3D CRT or an MLC based plan, what I would do is in patients with either lung cancer or leukemia, I would go ahead and contour the entire brain on the CT, and especially I would make sure that the cribriform plate is nicely contoured. Also, I would make sure that the temporal lobes, which are again lying at a lower level, are adequately covered. So all these borders in air, C1, C2 or C2, C3, as long as your posterior fossa is covered adequately. So that would be my borders. Is that clear?
Yeah.
I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I hope that's clear now. So again, the next question is, we have discussed the role of PCI in complete response, patient who are completely responding, or the partial response. The candidates are asking about if there is any stable disease or the progressive disease, what is the role of PCI?
Correct. Patients with any patient who does not have progressive disease on chemotherapy is a candidate for PCA. So as I mentioned earlier, if patients have progressive disease, then they are at a higher chance of dying because of their extracranial disease itself, since they have failed on their first line chemotherapy and there is no effective second line chemotherapy in small cell lung cancer as of now. It doesn't really make sense to go ahead and offer PCA in patients who have had progressive disease. So anything short of that, so if they just had stable disease or if they had complete response or partial response, all these patients are candidates for PCA.
But not in progressive disease?
Not in progressive disease. So I see somebody here has mentioned that the subarachnoid space is the reason why C2, C3 is kept. This is a popular misconception. The subarachnoid space in fact is continuous. So the all three layers of the meninges continue from the brain till the cauda equina. So even when I was doing my MD, I do remember some of my teachers saying that the subarachnoid space is the reason why we keep that, but that's not really the case.
Exactly. Yeah. So the next question is, we have talked about hippocampal sparing to prevent the neurocognition, but what's the role of, is there any role of scalp sparing radiation to prevent the alopecia?
So yes, so we do this at the doses that you deliver. There is chance that the patients can have alopecia, but so there are two ways of looking at it. So when I'm looking at small cell cancer lung, whether it is extensive stage or limited stage, the survival is quite poor. So in limited stage, the median overall survival is 24 months. In extensive stage, the median overall survival is 12 months. So within 1 to 2 years, most of these patients are not going to survive longer than that. So is there really any sense in going and doing all this scalp sparing and putting at risk not covering their brain? I would really doubt that. Possibly in leukemia patients, you can do that, but as I mentioned, in leukemia, PCA is kind of going more and more out of vogue. So, and the doses that you deliver in leukemia is quite low, so you wouldn't really expect any permanent alopecia in those patients. So it's really a moot point there.
Okay. Thank you. And the next question is, what should be the timing for PCI?
All right, excellent question. So as a so as the operant meta-analysis showed, earlier initiation is better. So, but that does not mean that we give PCA along with chemotherapy. So when patients receive chemotherapy and prophylactic cranial RT, the neurotoxicity is going to be quite high.
Higher.
Both when the patients are receiving methotrexate in leukemia patients or when patients are receiving etaposide cisplatin, the neurotoxicity is going to be high. So I would wait for their chemotherapy to complete and then only do radiation. So what we do in our institution is limited stage patients, when they receive their CTRT, as soon as they finish CTRT, immediately we start their PCA. In fact, in patients with leukemia, the recommendation is that patients should not be, you should give at least a 24 to 48 hours gap from the last dose of cytarabine and methotrexate before you start PCA.
Okay. So there are a lot of questions regarding hippocampal doses. What constraint do you follow while planning for the hippocampal sparing, when you do hippocampal sparing?
Okay, all right. So the experience with hippocampal sparing is again largely drawn from the RTOG 933, which is in brain metastasis, where again a higher dose is given, 30 gray, or when you're doing a boost. That is when you're doing whole brain RT, what we generally do, the dose constraint that we follow is that we make sure that for the hippocampus or the hippocampal avoidance region gets a maximum dose not more than 16 gray and the mean dose of about 9 gray. So 9 gray and 16 gray is the data that we have from RTOG 933. And also we have recently published, Dr. Jayant from TMH has published data from the SCRT. But let me not go into that. The doses again with PCI are quite low. So there are no clear guidelines as to say how much dose hippocampus should receive, but I would make sure that they receive as low as possible. So that is the only principle I would follow there, as low as possible to the hippocampus.
So now for residents, they want the final answer for the doses for small cell lung cancer, for limited stage small cell lung cancer, PCI doses, for extensive stage small cell lung cancer, PCI doses, what for leukemia, and how doses changes as per age in the leukemia.
Okay, so in lung cancer, it is quite simple. So
Like
universally,
limited
what is
stage.
done is 25 gray in 10 fractions, regardless of whether it is limited stage or extensive
Okay.
stage. 25 gray in 10 fraction is done. If at all, if somebody does in non-small cell cancer, also the dose is similar. So in lung cancer, 25 gray in 10 fractions over 2 weeks is the dose schedule. In leukemia, uh, there have been different protocols, but what we do in our institution is that we do 12 gray in 8 fractions as prophylactic cranial RT or an equivalent dose. So that means 1.5 gray per fraction. So this is both in adults and also in pediatric age group. 12 gray in 8 fractions is the dose that you do in prophylactic cranial RT. In therapeutic, the dose is slightly higher, 18 gray. So patients who have CSF positivity, you do 18 gray in those patients, but that is not technically prophylactic cranial RT.
Sure. So I think we are done with the questions. There is one question: why does small cell lung cancer have an increased propensity to throw meds to the brain?
So there is no real answer to this. It's just that we've observed that. So this could be because of the
Exactly.
seed and soil theory that brain poses as a fertile soil, and small cell we know that is highly proliferative. So they have a propensity to easily metastasize. So it is both a very favorable seed and a very fertile soil. So that's why you have brain metastasis more common in small cell lung cancer.
So I think we are done with the questions.
So there are a couple of questions. There are a couple of questions on the YouTube channel which was actually going on live. So I'll just read out those questions because Dr. Tripti, you don't have the advantage of seeing them.
Yeah.
So Dr. Ananda Selva Kumar is asking, what is the role of HSWBRT or SRS in SCLC?
Okay, so again, this is not strictly under PCI. So these are in patients with brain metastasis. So that is where the role of SRS comes. So generally, until now, we have never been including patients with small cell cancer whenever we have done SRS, because we think that these patients do not do as well as patients with non-small cell cancer. But this recent interest is because of a recently published trial called as the FIRE SCLC. So this trial kind of randomized patients between SRS boost versus only whole vein RT in patients who have limited metastasis in brain with SCLC. And what they did show is that the control were obviously better, but the survival benefit was not there. So it's a very uncommon presentation that patients will have a solitary metastasis in the brain. So our experience has actually been quite poor in patients with small cell cancer. Whenever you have done either SBRT for the lung primary or SRS for the brain metastasis, they have done quite badly. But that's our very limited experience. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody.
I hope that answers the question. There's another question from Dr. Ananda again. What is the role of post PCI re-irradiation in SCLC? So I presume the question is that suppose you give.
Oh yeah. Oh okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Then the patient develops some.
Oh yeah, understood. Yeah, yeah. So that was a great question, Ananda. So basically, patients who receive PCI, not everybody are completely metastasis free. It is estimated that almost 25 to 30% of these patients who receive PCI actually can develop uh, metastasis later. So when they do develop symptomatic brain metastasis, we do go ahead and give radiation, because we know that about 45 to 50 gray of whole brain RT is still safe, and patients mostly when they receive PCI they would have just received 25 gray. So we do go ahead and give anywhere between 20 gray to 20 gray in 5 fractions, or 15 gray in 5 fractions, depending on the interval between PCI and their and when they develop brain metastasis. So depending on that interval, we do treat them just as a palliative measure to relieve their symptoms.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions by Dr. Surya Prakash Wankina. I hope I am pronouncing it right. So Dr. Surya Prakash has asked about the target volumes for PCI in small cell versus ALL, and I think you have already answered that.
Yeah, I think we did cover that. Yeah.
We'll move on to the next question. He said, are optic nerves cribriform region and the posterior part of globe a part of target volume for PCI in SCNC? I think we have already answered that, but just
That has already been
re-emphasize about
answered.
the optic nerves, the cribriform region, and the posterior globe part.
Yes.
Okay. And Dr. Rajesh Balakrishnan is asking a question: has the neurocognitive effects of whole brain RT studied in the PCI setting? I think the question is,
Sorry, can you come again?
yeah,
Yes,
has the neurocognitive effects of whole brain RT, have they been studied in the PCI setting?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So the studies that I mentioned, they did look at neurotoxicity in patients who have received PCI. So the comparison was between low dose and high dose, and even low doses are capable of causing chronic neurotoxicity. So they can have memory and intellectual deficits.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Dr. Naveen.
So one question from my side, Dr. Naveen.
Yeah.
So who may be the candidates in which you can opt for the MRI surveillance rather than giving the PCA?
Okay, so in our setting, it's the cost that is prohibitive. So
Exactly.
patients who opt not to have PCI would have to have frequent interval MRI. So that means every 3 months they need to have an MRI. So if somebody uh, is affording that, then I have absolutely no problem. So we have had a couple of patients who are professionals who do not want to have brain radiation and have memory loss. So such patients, if they are willing to have an MRI every 3 months, you can definitely keep them on surveillance.
So is there any subgroup in which we can proactively offer them MRI surveillance, like very small stage 1 kind of a small cell lung cancer?
So not a limited stage. The only subgroup which has been studied is in patients with extensive stage who have had
Okay.
some response to chemotherapy. So there is no real subgroup which I understood your question, but we do not have an answer to that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Dr. Shubham. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Tripti.
Naveen.
Thank you, Dr. Naveen.
I think it was a very comprehensive presentation. I think I enjoyed the most, and I learned a lot of new things. What I just learned was a scalp preserving.
That's
PCI.
correct.
I thought all the hair are lost because of chemotherapy, but now I know that radiation can also be blamed. So,
Yeah.
can I now ask Dr. Naveen, just stay on, Naveen.
Yep.
I want you to comment on the type of quiz that we asked, the type of questions. Were they difficult? Were they easy? Were we able to cover all whatever you said?
They were quite good. They were quite good. The questions were quite good. So when I was actually, I had also prepared a pre-test and a post-test. I did not even show the post-test.
Okay.
I like this gamification, so that's the reason I was showing this. I kept very simple questions, but your questions were quite good.
Okay.
But I think we've got the idea from Naveen on how to, structure our quiz, because
Yeah, you should definitely try this. Give
Yeah.
it.
Very
Give it a
interesting.
win.
Yes. I think
Yeah.
that Menti thing I am going
Mentees.
to try. Yes, I will try.
So there are multiple websites.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just privately message
It's
me.
kind of a live
Sure,
voting,
sure.
no?
Yes, it is
Kind of a
live.
live
That's
voting.
brilliant. That is very good.
Exactly.
That's very good.
We were actually trying to find something very innovative for this, and I think Menti
Okay.
answers most of our thing, but definitely do share with us. So
I'll do that.
yeah, so just a second, just let me share this thing. So can we see the answers, everybody? Can we see the screen?
No.
Okay. So just a second. Okay, just give me a minute again. Okay, I think we can see the
Yeah.
screen now. Dr. Geeta, Dr. Tripti, we can see the screen now.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
okay.
visible,
So
yeah.
here
The
are the
number
answers.
galat likha hua hai.
Ah.
Number is
Yes,
different
sure.
now.
Okay, okay. So Dr. Tripti, the answers, please.
So the first question was, which part of the brain has a blood-brain barrier? So anterior pituitary gland has a blood-brain barrier. There are 4 regions which don't have a blood-brain barrier. They have done a study long back where they have given some contrast, and they've seen it reaches up to the posterior pituitary gland, pineal gland, and median eminence of hypothalamus and area posterior. And they say they are lacking, or may say there is a weak blood-brain barrier in these areas. The fourth option is posterior pituitary gland. It's not the anterior pituitary gland.
Okay, great. This is the second question.
So the second question, which of the following patient would be most appropriate? The question is the most appropriate subset which was assessed was the patient who showed the complete response after chemotherapy, or they have given the PCI and they were not having any evidence of brain metastasis. Option 2 is right. So the third question that was like discussed in detail by Dr. Naveen also, the last option, the most patient included in the meta-analysis received 30 grade 10 fractions, though they have received various fractionations from the 8 grade single fraction to 25 grade 10 fractions, 30 grade 10 fraction up to 36 grade, but approximately 60% patients were there who received 24 to 25 grade in 10 fractions, and from this meta-analysis only the 25 grade 10 fraction regime came in limited stage small cell lung cancer. So the answer is this one is wrong. So again, the volumes are in detail discussed by Dr. Naveen. So all of the volumes to be included in the target volumes for PCI. The next question is, with regard to radiation-induced brain injury, which one of the following statement is false? Actually, I put like little statement so that people like juniors can remember these things, because these are the changes which are caused by radiation-induced brain injury. There is leakage in the blood-brain barrier and subsequent edema. There is not gray matter changes. There are white matter necrosis occurs in the brain after radiation therapy. So the brain irradiation leads to acute burst in apoptotic cell damage, and there is demyelination and vasculopathy. And so they should remember all these points for the radiation-induced brain injury. So option 2 is wrong. It's white matter necrosis, not the gray matter necrosis.
So this was our sequence 1, 2, 4, 4, 2. And may I now request Dr. Geeta to tell us the number of people who responded and how many of them got it correct, if any got correct. Yeah.
Okay, finally we have that one person who's got all the questions right. This is the 4th edition of lectures in the Cancer Academy. Finally, we've got that one person. I think now we've got to really work hard on the prizes, because we finally got that one person who's got all the answers right, and that is Dr. Ayushi from RML IMS. I think that is from Lucknow. Is it?
Maybe
RML Institute of Medical Sciences.
Yeah. RML
Yeah,
is
no.
Lucknow. So she has got it right. So many
That's
congratulations to Dr. Ayushi. And I must also mention 3 other names who got 4 of them right. And that is Dr. Tulika Singh from RGCI, Dr. Sandeep Tiwari again from RGCI, and Dr. Bharat Nandu from Sion Hospital in Mumbai. So congratulations to them as well. But now we know the act has been upped, so we have to figure out a method of sending out prizes for the one who gets it all right. So maybe Ayushi, we may figure out a method to send a prize out to you.
Okay.
So it was an excellent presentation. Dr. Naveen was brilliant. And this is what I gathered. I've got some private messages also which said that, it's been a great lecture. And we are onwards in this journey. And the next one also promises to be very, very interesting. And Shubham is coming up with the next tutorial for you.
So can you see the screen, Dr. Geeta?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. I'm not able to enlarge it, but this is the next lecture. The upcoming tutorial is by Dr. Rakesh Jalali on proton therapy, the what, why, and how. And this is a very commonly asked question in the new technique. So this is what comes in paper 4 of the radiation. And I have also seen it in the medical oncology DNB paper. the final exam about the proton therapy, and this is the latest toy which is available to our radiation oncologists. And I'm sure all of us are curious to know. Dr. Jalali has agreed to be our speaker hosting, and he's the head of the only proton facility in the country. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of attendance for this. I must say that the attendance for this was almost 150. We crossed 100 attendees in the first 5 minutes of opening the slot. And we had another 50 attendees on the YouTube channel. Somebody asked me, are we recording this? So we are recording this, and this will be made available on the YouTube channel as well. So thank you, Dr. Naveen. Thank you, Dr. Geeta. Thank you, Dr. Tripti. And thank you for everybody who attended. We are trying to make it better every time. And I'm sure the next class will be even better. Thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Let me
Thank you.
just say that this is a great initiative, and all the best for your future sessions.
Thanks
Thanks for
Naveen.
having me here.
Dr. Geeta is saying something. Dr. Geeta,
Yeah,
please.
thank you, and thank you to Tripti, because I think you moderated the session brilliantly well. I know I'm really proud of all our colleagues who are pitching in to make this a very successful venture, and you did a great job. And I'm
Thank
sure
you
next
for
time
such a
around
nice
we'll
video.
have
Sure.
another radiation oncologist who, from our stable, who would be moderating the Dr. Rakesh Jalali show, and I'm sure you will come in bigger numbers because Dr. Rakesh Jalali is such a huge name to contend with, and he's a brilliant academician also. So I'm sure we will look forward to hosting you again. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank
Good night,
you, and
everybody.
very
Sure.
good night to all of you.
Good night.